She was 37 years old, and by the autumn of 1885 she owned nothing but a canvas grip, a homespun dress patched at both elbows, and $3.50 tucked into her boot. Her name was Delphine Corsi, and it was her own late husband's business partner, a calculating man named Silas Kettering, who had assumed full control of their modest freight partnership upon her husband's death, who had informed her plainly that a widow held no legal claim to the partnership's assets and that she would need to vacate the small house within the month. She gathered what little she could carry and made her way to the small Missouri Ozark town of Rye Hollow, where an old smokehouse behind a long-abandoned homestead, shunned by the whole community for 18 years since its owner's mysterious disappearance, was being sold by the county for $3 simply to clear the parcel from the tax rolls. Nobody else would go near it, for the whole of Rye Hollow believed the smokehouse carried a curse, and Delphine paid the $3 anyway. Drawing quiet, uneasy laughter from the men at the courthouse who called it the last resort of a truly desperate woman. What none of them knew, what Delphine herself did not yet know as she ducked beneath that low, blackened doorway for the first time, was that tucked into the rafters above lay a map that had been waiting 18 years to be found, one that would not only rescue her from poverty but would return to Rye Hollow a truth the whole town had spent nearly 2 decades trying not to ask about. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Delphine Corsi. If you have ever been warned away from something simply because others were too afraid to look closely at it, tell us in the comments where you are watching from tonight. Delphine had been born Delphine OTT in 1848 on a modest hill farm outside Rolla, Missouri, the third of 6 children to a father who worked as surveyor for the county and a mother who ran their small household with a thrift and resourcefulness that left a lasting impression on all her children, but particularly on Delphine, who trailed after her father on his surveying trips whenever her mother could spare her from chores at home. Her father, a patient man named Augustus OTT, took a particular delight in teaching his daughter to read the land itself, showing her how a surveyor's chain and compass could reveal boundaries invisible to the untrained eye, how a stand of trees or a bend in a creek often marked old property lines long after the original markers had rotted away, and how the careful notation of landmarks on a map was, in its own way, a kind of permanent memory that could outlast the people who made it. Delphine absorbed these lessons with genuine enthusiasm, finding in the precise language of surveying, the bearings and distances and monuments, a satisfying order that appealed to her practical nature, and by the time she was 16 she could read a property map as fluently as any grown surveyor's assistant. A skill her father took quiet pride in even as her mother continued to hope Delphine might eventually turn her attention toward more conventional domestic pursuits. At 20, Delphine married a steady, hard-working freight hauler named Jonas Corsi, a man who ran a small overland freight partnership with his childhood friend Silas Kettering, moving good between the scattered towns of the Missouri Ozarks in the years before the railroad reached deep into that difficult, hilly country. Jonas and Delphine settled in Rye Hollow, a modest crossroads community built where 2 old wagon trails intersected, and Delphine, whose father's lessons in reading land and maps proved surprisingly useful in a freight business that depended entirely on knowing the safest, most reliable routes through difficult terrain, found herself gradually taking on more and more responsibility for planning the partnership's routes and maintaining its records, work that both Jonas and, somewhat more, reluctantly, Silas came to depend upon. Delphine and Jonas never had children, a private sorrow she carried quietly through their 15 years of marriage, and instead she poured her attention into the freight business and into the life of Rye Hollow itself, coming to know the town's families, its hidden shortcuts, and its long, layered history with the same careful attention she had once given her father's survey maps. It was during these years that Delphine first heard the whispered stories surrounding the old marsh homestead at the edge of town, a modest farm that had belonged to a solitary trapper and part-time surveyor named Eli Marsh, a man who had lived alone on that land for years, well-liked but private, until he vanished entirely in the autumn of 1867 without any trace or explanation, leaving behind an empty house and a smokehouse that had never been touched since, the whole property gradually consumed by the persistent belief that something dark and unexplained had happened there. The town's leading citizens of the time, a small circle of men who controlled most of Rye Hollow's local commerce and who included, as it happened, Silas Kettering's own father, had quietly discouraged any serious investigation into Eli Marsh's disappearance, suggesting he had simply moved on as trappers sometimes did, and the matter had settled, over the following years, into the comfortable shape of local legend rather than unresolved mystery, the smokehouse gradually acquiring a reputation for being cursed or haunted that kept even the town's children from venturing too near it. Life in Rye Hollow remained steady and modest for Delphine and Jonas through the 1870s and into the early 1880s, the freight partnership providing a comfortable if unspectacular living. Though Delphine noticed, in the years leading up to Jonas's death, a growing tension between her husband and Silas Kettering regarding the partnership's finances. Disagreements Jonas never fully explained to her, but which left him increasingly troubled and withdrawn in his final years. Jonas died suddenly in the winter of 1885 of a heart ailment that had given no warning, and within weeks of his burial, Silas Kettering informed Delphine, with a briskness that struck her as almost rehearsed, that the partnership agreement he and Jonas had signed years before specified that a surviving partner's widow held no claim to the business itself, only to whatever personal property her husband had held separately, property that amounted, once Silas had finished his accounting, to considerably less than Delphine had believed the couple possessed. She did not argue, sensing something evasive in Silas's manner that she could not immediately name but which left her deeply uneasy, and she packed what she could carry into a single canvas grip, leaving behind the small house that had been her home for 15 years. She had nowhere obvious to go and no family remaining close enough to offer real refuge, and it was while making inquiries at the county courthouse regarding the cheapest possible lodging in Rye Hollow that she overheard mention of the old marsh property finally being cleared from the tax rolls after 18 years of standing abandoned, the county eager to be rid of a parcel that had accumulated back taxes far exceeding its modest value, offering the whole property, house and smokehouse, included, to whoever would simply assume the debt, a sum that came to exactly $3. Delphine, with nowhere else to turn and a stubborn refusal to let herself be entirely undone by Silas Kettering's cold arithmetic, offered the money before she had fully considered what she was doing, moved by a practical recognition that shelter, however cursed the town believed it to be, was shelter nonetheless. The uneasy laughter that followed her from the courthouse was quieter than ordinary mockery, tinged with something closer to genuine unease, several of the men murmuring that Jonas Corse's widow had gone and bought herself the one property in Rye Hollow that decent folk still crossed the road to avoid. She walked out to the old marsh property that same afternoon, finding the house itself too far gone for any practical use, its roof largely collapsed, but the smokehouse, a small, sturdy log structure set apart from the main dwelling, had weathered its 18 years of abandonment considerably better, its thick walls and steep roof having kept the worst of the elements at bay even as vines and brush grew up thick around its base. Delphine spent her first days simply clearing the brush and forcing open the smokehouse's swollen door, and once inside, ducking beneath the low doorway into a single dim room still hung with ancient, rusted meat hooks and heavy with the old smoky smell that decades had not entirely erased, she began the work of making the space livable, sweeping out debris and testing the soundness of the structure with the same careful attention her father had once taught her to bring to any careful examination of land or building. It was on her fourth day, while assessing the smokehouse's rafters to determine whether the roof itself remained sound enough to withstand another winter, that Delphine noticed something wedged into the angle where two roof beams met near the structure's rear corner, a shape too regular and too deliberately placed to be simple debris or the nest of some animal. She fetched a ladder salvage from the ruined main house and climbed carefully up into the rafters, and there, tucked into a gap between the beam and the roof's undersheathing, wrapped in what had once been oilcloth but had degraded over 18 years into little more than brittle fragments, she found a rolled sheet of heavy paper, remarkably well preserved by its sheltered position, along with a small tin case that rattled faintly when she moved it. She carried both down carefully and unrolled the paper on the smokehouse's small work table, and her father's old training left her in no doubt within moments about what she was looking at, for it was unmistakably a surveyor's map, drawn with the same careful precision she had learned to read as a girl, depicting the whole of the land surrounding Rye Hollow with a level of detail far exceeding anything in the county's own official records. The map bore Eli Marsh's own name in the corner, along with a date from 1867, the very year of his disappearance, and as Delphine studied it more closely, cross-referencing its markings against her own considerable knowledge of the local terrain built up over 15 years of planning freight routes, she began to understand that this was no ordinary survey but a careful, private record of a mineral claim, a substantial vein of lead ore that Eli Marsh had apparently discovered on land just north of town, land that, according to the map's careful notations, remained legally unclaimed and unregistered at the county office, a fact Delphine found genuinely puzzling given the obvious value The tin case, when she pried it open, held the answer to that puzzle, and considerably more besides. Inside, She found a short, careful letter in Eli Marsh's own hand, dated only days before his disappearance, along with a modest quantity of raw samples and a folded document that appeared to be a partial, unfiled claim registration. The letter explained that Eli had discovered the lead vein some months before while surveying the northern hills for his own private interest, and that he had begun the process of filing a formal claim, only to discover, through careful inquiry at the county office, that a group of Rye Hollow's leading citizens, men who controlled the local land office and much of the town's commerce, had for years been quietly and illegally suppressing knowledge of the region's mineral wealth, filing false or incomplete surveys to keep the true extent of the areas or deposits hidden from ordinary settlers and speculators alike, reserving the most valuable claims for eventual acquisition by their own small circle once the railroad, then still years from reaching that remote country, finally arrived and made large-scale mining commercially viable. Eli's letter named names, including, to Delphine's considerable shock, Silas Kettering's own father, Reuben Kettering, as one of the scheme's principal organizers, and stated Eli's clear intention to file his claim openly and publicly, circumventing the corrupt local land office entirely by traveling to the state capital himself, a journey his final letter indicated he intended to begin within the week. Delphine sat with that letter long into the evening, the smoke haze dim and quiet around her, and understood with a slow, dawning horror exactly what the town's 18-year-old mystery likely concealed. Eli Marsh had not simply vanished into the wilderness as a comfortable local legend suggested, but had very probably been silenced, one way or another, by men determined to protect a scheme worth a considerable fortune, men whose sons and heirs, Silas Kettering prominent among them, still controlled a great deal of Rye Hollow's commerce and standing to this very day. She understood, too, the danger inherent in what she now possessed, for a scheme capable of silencing a man to protect its secrecy 18 years before would hardly hesitate to move again against a penniless widow who threatened to expose it, particularly a widow whose own late husband's business partner numbered among the very families implicated in Eli's letter. She did not act rashly, understanding from her father's own careful methods that a claim built on solid, verifiable evidence would withstand scrutiny far better than accusation alone, and she began, quietly and patiently, to cross-reference Eli Marsh's map against the county's own official land records, work that her years of freight route planning had prepared her to undertake with genuine skill. She discovered, through careful and discreet inquiry at the county courthouse, that the official surveys covering the northern hills, filed decade before under Reuben Kettering's supervision as the area's original land commissioner, were indeed curiously vague and incomplete regarding mineral deposits, a pattern that, once she knew to look for it, extended across a considerable portion of the county's most promising terrain. She sought out an elderly former assayer named Cornelius Prine, long retired but still sharp of mind, who had worked briefly for the county land office in its earliest years before resigning under circumstances he had never fully explained, and who confirmed to Delphine, once she showed him Eli Marsh's careful private survey, that he had always privately suspected the official surveys of those years were deliberately incomplete, though he had never possessed proof sufficient to make such an accusation against men as prominent as Reuben Kettering. It was inevitable that word would eventually reach Silas Kettering that his late partner's widow, having taken possession of the old Marsh property, was making careful inquiries at the county courthouse regarding decades-old land surveys. He came to see her himself on a gray afternoon in late October, finding her at the Smokehouse with an expression of controlled unease that Delphine had never before seen him display in all her years of dealing with him through the freight partnership. He suggested, in a tone that struck her as carefully measured, that whatever old papers she believed she had found in that cursed ruin was surely of little real consequence after so many years, and that a widow with no resources and no standing in Rye Hollow would do well to leave old, unfortunate history undisturbed rather than risk stirring up trouble that could only bring her further hardship. When Delphine did not yield, his tone hardened considerably, and he reminded her plainly that whatever modest goodwill the town still extended to Jonas Corse's widow depended a great deal on her willingness to let matters rest, a threat delivered with a coldness that confirmed, more than any document could have, exactly how much he understood about what she had found. Delphine thanked him for his visit with more composure than she entirely felt, and after he left she understood clearly that she had very little time before he would move more decisively, and that whatever she meant to do, she needed to act soon in the open, where he could not simply make the matter disappear the way she now believed his own father had once made Eli Marsh disappear. She traveled to the state capital herself within the fortnight, carrying Eli Marsh's original survey map, his letter, the samples, and the partial claim registration, along with Cornelius Prine's own signed statement regarding his suspicions of the county's incomplete official surveys, and presented her case directly to the state land office, the very body Eli Marsh himself had intended to approach 18 years before his journey was cut short. The state examiner who received her, a methodical man named Whitcomb Hale who had handled mineral claim disputes across the territory for over a decade, recognized immediately in Eli Marsh's careful survey the hand of a trained and honest surveyor, and he opened a formal investigation into the county's historical land office records, an investigation that, once state auditors began cross-referencing decades of filed and unfiled surveys against known mineral deposits, revealed a pattern of suppression across the northern hills too extensive and too consistent to be dismissed as mere clerical oversight. Faced with Eli's original map, his letter naming names, Cornelius Prine's corroborating testimony, and the state's own independent audit confirming the pattern, the investigation moved forward with a thoroughness that no amount of local influence could easily deflect, and though Reuben Kettering himself had died some years before and could face no direct reckoning, his son Silas found himself compelled to answer before the State Land Commission regarding his own knowledge of and continued benefit from a scheme his father had helped establish. The commission ultimately ruled that the suppressed mineral lands, including the lead vein Eli Marsh had originally discovered, be properly surveyed and open to legitimate claim by Rye Hollow's own residents and any other settlers wishing to file, rather than remaining reserved for the small circle of families who had long profited from the deception. A ruling that stripped Silas Kettering and his associates of the quiet advantage they had maintained for decades, and that required Silas, under continued legal pressure, to finally settle Delphine's rightful share of the freight partnership's assets he had helped build over 15 years of careful, unacknowledged wealth. Delphine took no particular satisfaction in Silas's discomfort, remembering her father's old teaching that a map's purpose was simply to reveal what was true rather than to punish, but she did insist, with the state examiner's support, that Eli Marsh's own name be formally and publicly credited for the original discovery, restoring to a solitary, quiet man some measure of the recognition and justice that had been stolen from him alongside his life. With her own restored share of the freight partnership's assets, Delphine did what she believed Eli Marsh himself would have wanted done, filing a modest claim of her own on a portion of the newly opened mineral land and using the proceeds, once the claim began producing steady income, to restore the old smokehouse and the property around it, not as a private curiosity but as a working homestead she opened generously to Rye Hollow's poorer families as a source of honest employment in the years that followed, work that gradually transformed the community's relationship with the very ground its founders had once so carefully hidden. It is worth remembering, now, how this story began. A widow of 37, cast out with $3.50, buying for that same small sum a smokehouse the whole town believed was cursed, its secret waiting 18 years in the rafters for someone patient enough to climb up and look. Delphine Corson never forgot the uneasy laughter that followed her from that courthouse, and she never forgot, either, her father's patient lessons about reading land, that a map, properly understood, is nothing less than a promise kept across time, a record left by someone who trusted that the truth, however long buried, would eventually find its way into honest hands. Eli Marsh had hidden his map in those rafters not out of fear alone, but out of faith that someday, someone careful enough to look up rather than simply away would find it and understand exactly what it demanded of them. And Delphine had honored that faith not by keeping the mineral wealth for herself alone, but by returning to an entire community the honest opportunity that had been quietly stolen from it for nearly 2 decades. What that map revealed did shock the whole of Rye Hollow, not merely because it solved an 18-year mystery, but because it returned to that town the plain, essential truth that the places everyone had learned to fear and avoid so often hold within them exactly the honesty community has been waiting, without knowing it, to recover. Thank you for spending this time with Delphine Corsi in the town of Rye Hollow tonight. If her story moved you, we hope you will share it with someone who needs reminding that the things we've been taught to fear sometimes hold exactly what we need to find. We would love to know, in the comment below, what is a time you found real value in something everyone else had already decided to avoid or forget? Take care of one another, and take care of the quiet, overlooked corners of your own life where something honest might still be waiting. Until next time, stay close.